The helicopter hovered low over the dense forest of Embugasu. Thousands of flyers drifted down, scattering across the ground. Each one carried the faces of Liana Friedenbach, 16 years old, and Felipe Silva Caffé, 19, two students who had left São Paulo for a quiet weekend and never came back. Below, Liana's father, Ari Friedenbach, stood among police officers and search teams. Days had passed, phones were dead, and stories no longer matched, and the harder it became to believe this was just a case of two teenagers lost in unfamiliar terrain. As officers retraced paths through abandoned farms and narrow trails, two names kept resurfacing, names locals associated with these woods and with fear. And by the time the truth surfaced, one of the teens was already dead, and the other would soon meet the same fate. This is the story of two young students who disappeared into the woods of Embugasu and were held captive for days by a group of 5. What followed would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Brazilian history. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Liana Friedenbach grew up in São Paulo in a home where structure, trust, and routine quietly shaped her everyday life. And from an early age, she was surrounded by a sense of stability that made her feel protected and understood. She lived with her parents and her younger brother in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, and inside that home, conversations were open, expectations were clear, and affection was constant, but never suffocating. Her father, Ari Friedenbach, worked as a lawyer, and her mother managed the household, creating an environment where discipline and care existed side by side. Liana was especially close to her father, and that bond stood out to everyone who knew them, because it was built on trust rather than control. Ari knew her routines, her habits, and the rhythm of her days, and Liana, in return, was used to explaining where she was going, who she would be with, and when she planned to return. It was not something she felt forced to do, but something that came naturally because their relationship worked on honesty, and that honesty had never really been tested before. Ari often drove her to the bus stop for school activities, the gym, or youth programs. And over time, those small routines became part of how he measured normalcy, because as long as they stayed intact, everything felt right. Faith and discipline played a quiet but important role in Liana's life, and she was actively involved in her religious community, attending youth programs and social activities that gave her a strong sense of belonging. She cared about her health and took fitness seriously, spending time at the gym and paying attention to her well-being, not out of pressure, but because it made her feel balanced. She also had a distinct personal style, dressing in dark clothing, listening to rock music, and wearing accessories that set her apart from her peers. Education mattered in the Friedenbach household, and Liana treated it with the same seriousness she brought to other parts of her life. She was thoughtful about how she learned best, and after discussing it with her parents, she decided to switch to night classes, believing she retained information better in the evenings. In August 2003, her parents transferred her to Colégio São Luís, one of the most respected private schools in São Paulo, not because there was a problem where she had been, but because they wanted to place her in an environment that would challenge her academically and open more doors in the future. Joining a new school in the middle of the semester was not easy, and at first Liana struggled to adjust, but she adapted quickly, found her footing, and settled into her routine. By 16, Liana was already thinking ahead, and she spoke openly about her plans for the future, including her interest in studying physical education and eventually attending university. She had begun preparing for the FUVEST exam, even though she was still young, because planning early felt natural to her, and those close to her saw it as another sign of how grounded she was. Nothing about her life suggested recklessness or secrecy, and if anything, her parents believed they knew their daughter well, because up until that point, she had given them every reason to feel that way. Then at 16, Liana fell in love for the first time, and that was where everything changed. Felipe Silva Caffé came from a background that was quieter and more modest than Liana's, but it was one that shaped him into someone deeply focused and deliberate, and those who knew him often described him as a young man who carried responsibility naturally without needing to announce it. Felipe attended Colegio San Luis as a scholarship student, and that fact mattered because it meant he had secured his place through effort and consistency, not family connections or privilege. During the day, he worked, balancing jobs that helped support himself and ease the financial weight on his family. And then at night, he studied, often arriving at school already tired but never disengaged. He talked about his ambitions, especially his interest in studying law and eventually joining the police force. When Felipe met Lyanna, the connection did not arrive with drama or grand gestures, but developed naturally through small conversations and shared moments in school spaces where students gathered between classes. Lyanna was new, dressed differently from most of her peers, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that stood out, and Felipe noticed her almost immediately. Friends later said that the two seemed comfortable around each other from the beginning. Felipe treated Lyanna with care, and that detail did not go unnoticed, especially by her father. One afternoon, Friedenbach arrived at the school to pick up his daughter, and as Lyanna walked toward the car, Felipe accompanied her all the way to the door before turning back. Ari watched the interaction closely, then asked almost casually, "Is that your boyfriend?" And Lyanna smiled before answering, "Not yet." The next day, the same routine repeated itself, Felipe walking her to the car again, and this time, when Lyanna got in, she looked at her father and said, "Guess what? He's my boyfriend now." Ari was pleased to see his daughter happy, and although he did not yet know Felipe well, he chose not to interfere or push too hard, trusting that Lyanna's judgment had always guided her well. For Lyanna, this relationship marked her first experience with love, and for Felipe, it felt like something he approached with seriousness rather than excitement alone. Over the next 2 months, from August into September 2003, they grew closer, spending time together when they could, sharing plans, and even exchanging promise rings. But after 2 months together, they made a decision that changed everything. The idea of the trip did not begin as something secret or reckless, and at first, it sounded like nothing more than a simple plan to spend a weekend away from the city. Felipe had been to Embugasu before with friends, and in his mind, it was a place where they camped, cooked together, and escaped the pressure of school and work for a short time. And when he mentioned it to Lyanna, she listened with interest rather than hesitation. Initially, the plan involved other people. Felipe's friends were supposed to go with them, and that detail mattered because the trip was never imagined as a private escape for just the two of them. But as the days passed, those plans began to fall apart quietly. One friend backed out because of work, another because of family obligations, and then another simply stopped responding. And with each withdrawal, the group grew smaller until there were no friends left to go at all. At that point, Felipe still wanted to make the trip, and Lyanna wanted to spend time with him. They talked it through, considered the options, and then agreed to go alone, believing that nothing about the trip itself had changed except the number of people attending. To them, it was still a short camping getaway, something they would return from with stories and photos, not something that needed to be questioned too deeply. So, Felipe told his parents that he was going camping with friends, which was not unusual for him and did not raise concern, because he had done similar things before. Lyanna, however, knew that her situation was different because her parents were more protective, especially when it came to places she had never been and people they did not know well. She understood that asking directly would lead to a refusal, so instead, she constructed a version of the weekend that sounded safe, familiar, and entirely supervised. She told her parents that she would be spending Friday night with her youth group and then leaving early the next morning for a trip to Ilhabala, a destination she had visited before and one her father would not question. She explained that the group would be traveling together, that adults would be present, and that everything had already been arranged. And because this explanation aligned perfectly with her usual activities, it did not trigger suspicion. She even mentioned that she would not need a ride to the bus stop, saying Felipe would walk her there, something that had already become routine. And in doing so, she removed the final detail that might have felt out of place. But what they did not know was that Embugasu watched outsiders closely. On Friday, October 31st, 2003, the school day ended like any other, and from the outside, nothing about that afternoon hinted at what was already unfolding beneath the surface. When classes at Colegio San Luis finished, Lyanna did not head home, and instead, she met Felipe just beyond the school gates, both of them carrying backpacks that held everything they believed they would need for the weekend. They could not go home because doing so would unravel the story Liana had told her parents, and they could not travel into the countryside right away either, because buses toward the rural outskirts of São Paulo did not resume until early morning. So they went downtown, blending into the noise and movement of São Paulo, and eventually settled beneath the wide concrete span of the Museum of Art of São Paulo, the MASP, a place that often became an informal gathering spot late at night. Liana checked her phone occasionally, careful not to call anyone who might ask questions, and Felipe kept track of the time, waiting for the moment when buses would begin running again. And, as the first light of morning spread across the city, they gathered their things, stood up from the bench, and made their way toward the transit lines that would take them out of São Paulo and into unfamiliar territory. When the bus finally pulled into Embugasu, the change was immediate. The noise and movement of São Paulo faded behind them, replaced by quieter streets, fewer people, and a sense that everything moved at a different pace. Liana and Felipe stepped off at the terminal with their backpacks, looking around as if to orient themselves. From there, they made their way towards Santa Rita, a small village near the rural area where they planned to camp, and as they moved farther from the terminal, the surroundings grew more sparse. Houses were spaced farther apart, roads became narrower, and conversations dropped to a low murmur, because even without anyone saying it out loud, both of them could feel that they were no longer just visitors passing through a busy place. They stood out as two young people from the city carrying large backpacks into an area that was not used to seeing them. Then they took a taxi to go deeper into the countryside, asking to be dropped off near a dirt road that led toward the area Felipe remembered from previous trips. And once the car disappeared down the road, Liana and Felipe were left alone with the landscape. From that point on, there were no more vehicles, no crowds, and no easy way back. They began walking the remaining 4.5 kilometers, following the path toward an abandoned farm Felipe believed would offer privacy and shelter. As they moved farther along the trail, the signs of abandonment became clearer. Fences leaned at odd angles, vegetation crept over old structures, and eventually, the outline of the farm appeared, its walls worn down by time and neglect. The house itself was clearly unused, windows broken, surfaces marked by years of exposure, and yet, to the couple, it still felt like a suitable spot, isolated enough to avoid interruption and close enough to the trail to find again if they needed to leave. It was on that walk, before they reached the farm, that they passed two men coming from the opposite direction. The encounter was brief and unremarkable from Liana and Felipe's perspective, just a quick glance as they stepped aside on the narrow path. But the reaction on the other side was different. The two men, Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known locally as Champinha, and Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, known as Pernambuco, noticed them immediately, taking in the backpacks, the city clothes, and Liana's presence. They stopped and watched as the couple walked away, disappearing down the trail toward the abandoned farm. And from that moment on, Liana and Felipe were no longer just two teenagers on a camping trip. As night settled over the abandoned farm, the forest around Liana and Felipe grew quieter. They finished setting up the tent beneath the weakened roof structure nearby, trying to make the space feel temporary and safe, and for a short moment, it almost worked. But before they went to sleep, Liana's phone rang. It was her father, Ari Friedenbach, calling to check in, just as he always did. She answered calmly, keeping her voice steady, but Ari immediately noticed something that did not sit right with him. The background was quiet. Too quiet for a bus full of young people heading out on a group trip, and there was no laughter, no chatter, none of the usual sounds he expected to hear. He asked her about it, and Liana responded quickly, saying they had left very early and that most people were asleep, and on its own it did not raise alarm. So Ari accepted it, then asked her to promise she would call again once she arrived at her destination. Liana agreed, and the call ended, leaving Ari with a faint unease he could not yet explain. Not long after, Liana and Felipe lay down inside the tent. They believed they were alone, and with no reason to think otherwise, sleep came quickly. But at some point in the darkness, that sense of isolation broke. The attack happened suddenly and without warning. Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known as Champinha, and Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, known as Pernambuco, approached the tent under the cover of darkness, having already watched the couple earlier that day. Pernambuco moved first, using a knife to slice through the side of the tent, creating an opening large enough to force his way inside, while Champinha stood close, ready to control whoever came out. As the fabric tore open, both men shouted orders immediately, telling Felipe Silva Caffé and Liana Bay Friedenbach not to scream and not to move. Felipe reacted first, trying to sit up, but Pernambuco grabbed him and dragged him out of the tent, forcing him to the ground before he could understand what was happening. Champinha turned to Liana, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from Felipe, stopping her when she tried to reach him. Felipe shouted Liana's name, and she answered him, but their voices were cut short as the men separated them, pushing Felipe several steps away and keeping Liana behind. Pernambuco ordered Felipe to stay quiet and keep his head down, while Champinha warned Liana not to resist. Champinha and Pernambuco then restrained both of them, covering their eyes so they could no longer see where they were being taken. With their vision gone, the sense of place disappeared instantly. They forced the couple to walk away from the campsite, deeper into the forest, but the tent, their backpacks, and their personal belongings remained behind, exactly where they had been left, untouched. This shows that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong, but a deliberate attack on the couple. From that moment on, Liana Bay Friedenbach and Felipe Silva Caffé were no longer on a camping trip, they were captives. Champinha and Pernambuco forced Liana and Felipe into a small house hidden deep in the rural area, a place that belonged to Antonio Caetano da Silva, and from the moment they entered, the situation escalated from kidnapping to prolonged captivity. Champinha immediately pulled Liana away from Felipe, shutting her into a separate room, while Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, known as Pernambuco, restrained Felipe and forced him to remain seated and silent. The separation was deliberate, and it removed any possibility that Felipe could protect her or intervene. Pernambuco tied Felipe to a chair and stayed close, watching him constantly, and every time Felipe tried to move or speak, Pernambuco warned him to stay quiet. Felipe could hear voices moving through the house and could hear Liana at times, and that awareness became its own form of torment because he understood that something was happening to her and that he had no way to stop it. Inside the other room, Champinha began Liana. The attacks did not happen once and end, but continued over several hours, stretching through the night, while Liana remained trapped in the house with no ability to escape. She had never had relations before, as she was a virgin before the assault occurred. At the time, however, that reality only intensified the trauma because everything she experienced in that house happened without consent and without any sense of when it would stop. Despite what she was enduring, Liana tried to regain some control by speaking when she could. She told Champinha and Pernambuco that her family had money and that her father, Ari Friedenbach, was a lawyer, and she suggested that they could demand a ransom in exchange for letting her go, hoping that money might redirect their actions and give them a reason to keep her alive. The suggestion was discussed briefly, but it never became a real plan because the men did not treat her words as a negotiation, only as information. But that's not all. Pernambuco argued that Felipe could not be released because he could identify them and report everything to the police. And Champinha agreed, dismissing the idea of ransom and focusing instead on eliminating risks. No one spoke about releasing both of them, and no one spoke about letting the situation end peacefully. And from that point forward, Felipe was no longer viewed as a hostage, but as a liability. Later that night, Antonio Caetano arrived at the house. Instead of stopping what was happening or intervening, he accepted the situation and became part of the group, reinforcing the sense that the crimes unfolding there were not impulsive mistakes, but choices being repeated and normalized. His presence extended the duration of the captivity and confirmed that no one inside that house intended to call for help or change course. As the night wore on, exhaustion overtook both teenagers. Liana remained awake out of fear and necessity, because sleep offered no safety, while Felipe stayed restrained, drained physically and emotionally by what he could hear and what he could not do. And by the next day, the group decided Felipe could not stay alive. But before that, Champinha, Pernambuco, and Antonio Caetano moved Liana and Felipe again the following day, November 2nd, 2003, taking them farther into the rural area and bringing them to a second house owned by Antonio Matias de Barros, a location even more isolated than the first. Champinha continued to subject Liana to SA, and this time the did not happen in isolation. Another man arrived at the house. His name was Agnaldo Pires, an adult associate of the group. He arrived knowing that a teenage girl was being held there against her will, and instead of leaving or intervening, he chose to stay. After his arrival, Agnaldo Pires also carried out SA against Liana, further extending the duration of her captivity and suffering. But when Antonio Matias, the house owner, came around, he did not carry out SA himself, but but he knowingly allowed his house to be used for Lyanna's continued confinement and to make matters worse, the teens were not fed during this time. During this period, Champinha repeatedly presented Lyanna as his girlfriend whenever anyone was present, a lie he used to reduce suspicion and maintain control. When Champinha's brother came to the house looking for him, concerned because their mother did not know where he was, Champinha introduced Lyanna as his girlfriend once again. By the third day of captivity, Champinha and Pernambuco took Felipe out of Antonio Matias de Barros's house and led him into the woods, choosing a narrow trail that cut away from the property and disappeared into dense vegetation. They told him to keep walking, and they did not explain where they were going, because by then, explanations were no longer necessary. Lyanna stayed behind with the others, but close enough to sense that something final was unfolding. Then the sound came. It was a single gunshot, breaking through the quiet of the woods. Lyanna froze where she stood, because she understood immediately what it meant, even before anyone confirmed it. She asked where Felipe was, and she asked what they had done to him. Champinha answered without hesitation and without emotion. He told her, he's free. Lyanna understood that free did not mean released, and it did not mean escape. It meant Felipe was gone, and it meant she was now alone among people who had already proven what they were capable of doing. By Saturday evening, Ari Friedenbach expected to hear from his daughter again. Lyanna had promised to call, and although the trip itself had already felt rushed, he told himself there was no reason to panic. But the hours passed and the call never came. He tried her phone that afternoon, then again in the evening, and each time it rang unanswered. Eventually, the calls went straight to voicemail. At first, Ari chose not to panic. He did not want to alarm Lyanna's mother unnecessarily, and he told himself that poor reception or a busy schedule could explain the silence. Still, that last conversation replayed in his mind. The quiet background noise on the bus, the way Lyanna had rushed the call, the strange feeling that something had been left unsaid. By Sunday, concern turned into fear. It had been 2 full days with no contact. Ari called again and again, and every attempt went unanswered. Lyanna's mother began calling as well, and when neither of them could reach her, Ari decided to stop guessing and start asking questions. He opened Lyanna's phone book and called one of her closest friends, asking directly where she was. At first, the friend denied knowing anything, but when Ari explained how long Lyanna had been unreachable and how serious the situation had become, the truth came out. Lyanna had not gone to Ilhabela with a youth group. She had gone away with Felipe Silva Caffé. That was the moment everything snapped into place. Ari did not wait. He got into his car with a friend and drove straight to Embugasu, the last confirmed location anyone could give him. They searched on their own, driving through back roads and small neighborhoods long after nightfall, stopping people, asking questions, calling Lyanna's name into the dark. No one had answers. No one had seen the 2 teenagers with backpacks. By Monday morning, the police had been notified, and officers immediately treated the situation as a possible abduction. In Embugasu, patrols spread across rural roads, questioning drivers, caretakers, and locals who knew the dangers of the region. Ari stayed close, following every development, printing flyers himself and handing them out to anyone who would take one. He called everyone he knew who might have connections or influence, refusing to sit still while time slipped away. A local businessman offered the use of a helicopter, and Ari accepted without hesitation. As the helicopter flew low over the forest, thousands of flyers carrying Lyanna's and Felipe's faces rained down over trees, dirt paths, and open clearings. Ari watched from below, knowing deep down that this was no longer a routine search. Something was very wrong. With 2 local officers guiding him, Ari later headed down a narrow dirt track toward an abandoned farm, a place locals avoided and rarely spoke about. Officers believed the area needed to be checked precisely because people stayed away from it. Ari walked with them through overgrown paths until he suddenly stopped. There was a tent. At first he hoped it was not theirs, but as he stepped closer, he saw Lyanna's flip-flops lying outside in the dirt, the same pair she wore almost every morning. The officers opened the tent, and the scene inside removed any doubt. A long knife slash ran down the side of the fabric. Inside, the bags were untouched, food still packed, nothing stolen, nothing disturbed except for the fact that the teenagers were gone. This was not 2 teens wandering off. One of the officers said it quietly, almost under his breath. He said it had Champinha's mark all over it. It was the first time Ari had heard the name. The suspicion was not random. The moment officers learned where the couple had disappeared, the same name surfaced again and again. Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known locally as Champinha, was feared in that region for all the wrong reasons. Word on the street said he had already and killed someone at the age of 14. He roamed those forests constantly, lingered around abandoned properties, and had a history of approaching outsiders who passed through the area. Every disturbance, every violent incident in that part of Embugasu seemed to circle back to him or his group. The officer riding with Ari had lived in the area for years. He knew the pattern, he knew the names, and when he heard about a young couple vanishing in those woods, he did not hesitate. This was exactly the kind of situation Champinha was known for. The manhunt began. Later that night, as the search intensified, Ari received a phone call. The man on the other end introduced himself only as a woodsman, someone who knew the forest better than anyone else. He had heard about the missing teenagers and wanted permission to help search. Ari agreed immediately. Hours passed in tense silence before the woodsman called again. This time, his voice carried urgency. He said he had encountered a man wandering drunk through the woods, rambling about things he should not have known. Details that pointed directly to Liana and Felipe. The woodsman took him to the local police station. Once the man sobered up, everything spilled out. His name was Antonio Caetano da Silva. After days of hiding, drinking heavily, and panicking about the police closing in, Caetano had lost control. He wandered through the area talking too much, saying names, describing locations, and revealing the first concrete link to the group that had taken Liana and Felipe. Caetano was known as a hanger-on, not a mastermind, but someone who followed the wrong people and participated without thinking through consequences. Police pressure intensified rapidly, and the atmosphere inside the group shifted from arrogance to panic. For the first time since the abduction, the men understood that they were no longer in control of the situation. They were being hunted, roads were being checked, locals were being questioned, and helicopters were now scanning the very area they thought would protect them. That night, Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, known as Pernambuco, fled. He left abruptly, disappearing into the darkness and heading away from Embugasu, desperate to save himself before the police arrived. But his escape did not calm the situation, it made it worse. His departure confirmed what the others already feared, that this was no longer a shared plan, but a collapsing one. With Pernambuco gone, Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known as Champinha, reached a conclusion that had been forming since Felipe's death. Lyanna was now the only witness left. If she survived, everything would unravel. The houses, the forest paths, the faces, the names, all of it would lead back to them. The problem they believed they had solved with Felipe now stood in front of them again. Champinha told the others he was going to release Lyanna. He said he would take her to a nearby bus stop and let her go. Still, no one stopped him. Lyanna followed Champinha because she had no strength left to resist. She was barefoot, exhausted, and barely speaking, and by that point, compliance felt safer than questioning what she was told. But Champinha did not lead her toward any road or bus stop. Instead, he walked her deeper into the forest, away from clear paths and toward thicker brush, where the sounds of helicopters faded and the silence returned. He used a machete, striking her in the neck and upper body. The attack was not a single blow, and it did not stop immediately. Lyanna reacted instinctively, trying to move away and escape, but she was barefoot, exhausted from days of captivity, and physically weakened. She managed only a few steps before collapsing, unable to outrun what was already unfolding. Champinha continued until she no longer moved. Once it was over, he did not stay with the body. He gathered his clothes and the machete, wrapped them together, and hid them in a nearby well, believing that removing those items would erase his connection to what he had done. He then left the forest alone, abandoning Lyanna's body where it fell, concealed by vegetation and distance. What had begun as a kidnapping had turned into multiple murders, and the group that once believed the forest protected them now scattered in panic, knowing there was no version of this that ended quietly. Afterward, everything collapsed. The men scattered, some hiding in the forest, others returning home, hoping distance would protect them from consequences, but it was already too late. Felipe's body had been discovered, and the case had changed completely. This was no longer a search for missing teenagers. It was now a murder investigation, and every one of them was on the radar. Days later, Lyanna Bay Friedenbach's body was found in the forest where she had been taken. And one by one, the suspects were arrested. Some talked immediately, attempting to reduce their responsibility by shifting blame, while others denied involvement until evidence forced their silence. The stories conflicted at first, but timelines, locations, and forensic findings closed the gaps they tried to leave open. When the case reached court, the roles of each participant were separated carefully because the crimes had not been equal in nature or responsibility. Antonio Caetano da Silva was convicted for multiple acts connected to the captivity and sexual violence and received a sentence of 124 years in prison, reflecting both his participation and his failure to intervene at critical moments. Agnaldo Pires, whose involvement centered on S.A. during Lyanna's captivity, was sentenced to 47 years, a punishment tied directly to the harm he chose to inflict. Antonio Matias de Barros, the owner of the second house, was convicted for illegal imprisonment, concealment, and aiding the perpetrators, but not for S.A., and his sentence reflected that distinction. He received 6 years of imprisonment and additional detention, a reminder that allowing crimes to happen carried its own consequences, even without direct violence. Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, known as Pernambuco, faced trial separately and was convicted of multiple crimes, including aggravated homicide, kidnapping, and S.A. The court sentenced him to 110 years and 18 days in prison, acknowledging both his actions and the prolonged nature of the crimes. He remained incarcerated from that point forward, with no ambiguity about his role. Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known as Champinha, stood apart from the others in one crucial way. He was a minor at the time of the crimes, which meant the criminal court could not sentence him as an adult. Instead, he was placed under juvenile detention, but medical evaluations changed the course of his future. Psychiatric assessments concluded that he posed a continuing danger to society, and when he reached adulthood, the courts ordered his indefinite psychiatric confinement, a decision upheld repeatedly despite multiple appeals. The trials closed the legal chapter, but the damage could not be undone. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.